Well, Professor, I think very few magicians realize that some of the moves, in card magic in particular, that have come to us from the gambling world, how some of these moves were not so easy to acquire, and some of the information was not so easy to get, and that you went to great lengths to get gamblers to tip to you, to tell you things about it. Most of the time it involves seeking out some obscure figure that you had heard about that you maybe you weren't even sure existed, and yet you go to great lengths to search for these people. And we heard about how you spent great time and effort trying to locate Erdnase, and which ended up, unfortunately, in not finding him. But sometimes your efforts were rewarded, and one of the times I can think about was when you were tracking down the will-o'-the-wisp, the center deal, and learning it from a man named Alan Kennedy. So maybe you can give us a little background on that.
Well, you know, nobody in the old books, anybody who's read magical literature, there's no reference to a center deal. There's no such thing. As somebody says, it's hard enough to deal a second card. How in the world are you going to deal a card from the center of the deck? I mean, that was unheard of. But while some years ago, there was a man in Chicago named John Sprong, and he wrote me a letter, and he says, I've heard a rumor that there's a man out west who can deal from the center of the pack. And he said, Vernon, if you can find out anything about this man, he said, I'm willing to pay $100 for that information. He said, I don't expect to meet the man, but any details about his mannerisms or where he lives or how old he is and what he can do, he said, I'm willing to pay $100 for any information about him. So I didn't know, I'd never heard of a center deal. Nobody'd ever heard of a center deal, so-called dealing the cards from the center of the deck. But I always kept it in mind. So it's a long story anyway. When I went out to Kansas City, finally I inquired, and they said, if anybody would know, there's a guy here named Snaky Davis. Now, I'd never heard of that name, Snaky Davis. I'd heard of Al Capone, but I'd never heard of Snaky Davis. Well, it appeared that during the Prendergast thing people, incidentally, that's where our president, Harry Truman, was born. And Prendergast was the political boss, and things were very wide open in Kansas City at the time. Mm-hmm. And this Snaky Davis, he was the czar, you might, or the king of the underworld. Yeah. And so they said, if you can find Snaky Davis, if there's anybody can deal from the center, he would know. So I said, where could you meet this guy, Snaky Davis? And I inquired all around. They said, you can't meet him. He said, he doesn't talk. He's the head of the mafia, one of the head of the mafia in Kansas City. Well, anyway, I never did meet Snaky Davis. It's a long story, but anyway, eventually I found a man who told me that this fellow lived in Pleasant Hill. Now, Pleasant Hill is just outside of Kansas City, about 60 or 70 miles out of Kansas City. So Charlie Miller, by that time, had heard a rumor of it too, and he came all the way from El Paso, and we drove to Pleasant Hill to look for this gambler who was supposed to be there. And we asked all around. He knew his name, Kennedy, that's all. And we went to the bank and tried to find out, and they said, I'm sorry, we don't give the names of people who have deposits here. I went to gas stations. It was only a small town, Pleasant Hill, and went to 2 or 3 gas stations. Said, do you ever sell gas to a fellow named Kennedy? No, no, no. Well, anyway, finally I gave up, and I went back again to Kansas City. And Charlie Miller left and went back to El Paso. But a week later, I went again. Oh, incidentally, I rented a big limousine because I didn't know who this Alan Kennedy was, but I was sure I was going to learn something from him if he could deal from the center of the pack. So anyway, I looked, and I couldn't find him. And I was going to get, the third time I went over there, rented this limousine. It was quite expensive in those days because I had to drive 75 miles in a rented car, and I kept it for several hours. And so anyway, I was sitting in the car ready to go home, and a little girl came out of a store eating an ice cream cone. And I noticed the cone was almost finished, and I said, come here, because I was going to give her a dime to get another cone. I called her over. I was sitting in my car, and she was afraid. So I said, come here, I'm not going to hurt you, but she was afraid to come. So anyway, she's almost crying when she comes to the end of the cone. So I took a quarter out of my pocket, and I flipped it over on the sidewalk. I said, buy yourself another cone. And the little girl picked it up and she went into the store and she came out all smiling, you know, with this ice cream cone. And so I said, little girl, come here, I'm not going to hurt you. You know, I'm not going to hurt you. And she came part way, but she wouldn't come up to the car. And I said, do you know a Mr. Kennedy in town? And she said, Mr. Kennedy lives in that white house at the top of the hill. And I thought, I'm not a Bible student, but I thought, a little child shall lead them. I thought, here, I've been looking all around, Charlie Miller and I, and banks and filling stations, and here's a little child. Oh, she can't be right. But anyway, I went up to this farmhouse, and I knocked on the door, and a man came in overalls, and he had a bandaged hand. He told me he'd been cranking his car. Oh, I said, what's the matter with you? When he knocked the door, I said, are you Mr. Kennedy? Now, I didn't know whether he was the right Kennedy or not, but he had a bandaged hand. His thumb was bandaged and his first finger. And I said, how'd you hurt your hand? He said, I was cranking my car, and he said, it buckled up, and I caught it on the fender or something, but in those days, you had to crank a car, if they, you know. So anyway, I said, you're not the man I said I heard about on the Atlantic. He said, what heard on the, because I was using a little con, you know, myself. I said, I heard about you on the Atlantic. You're not the man, are you? He said, what do you mean? I said, can you hop a card out of the center of the deck? He said, yes, come in. He got all excited. He says, you heard about me on the Atlantic? I said, yes, I was talking to some gamblers on the boat, and they told me that this man, that you could do it, a man named Kennedy. Oh, God, he said, they heard about me on the ships? He says, you know, the ambition of my life is to go on those ships to Europe and be able to play cards. He said, I can win $50,000, $60,000 from wealthy people. He says, people that have money. But he says, a guy like me couldn't get on a ship, could he? I said, why not? He says, well, you know, I wear overalls, and he says, I work in the soil. I'm just a farm guy, really. And I said, listen, you could go on there as a Texas oil man. I said, you could wear a cowboy hat. I said, you could dress in overalls. I said, they'd think you were an eccentric millionaire. That's all. You don't have to dress. I said, you can be a millionaire from Oklahoma or any oil country. So anyway, he was tickled to death. So he called his wife in, and he said, fix that table in the kitchen. He took me out in the kitchen, and that's enough. I mean, he showed me this mental deal and so on. I don't want to go into it. Take too much time to go into all the details. But I got the biggest thrill of my life when I saw him do it, because he was perfection, the way he did everything. Well, but so I finally found him.
You found
I taught Charlie, when I came back, I taught Charlie Miller the deal, and I taught a fellow named Johnny Scarney the deal.
And John, a funny story, when you tried to teach this to John Scarney, you tried to tell him the story behind it.
Yes, cut out all that bull, so cut it all out and show me. I said, this isn't bull, Johnny, this is a true thing, all the different, come on, cut out that crap and show me the deal. I don't want to hear these fairy stories. I said, this is absolute truth, Johnny. Okay, I'll cut it out, you know. He doesn't believe it. He's very skeptical about everything.
I think there's a funny story. When you went back to see Alan Kennedy, you took your young son.
That is an amusing story, you know. So I went back I went to Wichita, but I was really living in St. Joseph, Missouri, which is some distance from there. And I went back my wife was there with my little boy, and he was only about 7 years old at the time, Edward, Ted. I call him Ted. So I told my wife about this fellow, how wonderful he was. And my wife said, hey, you magicians are the craziest people how could anybody deal cards from the center of the pack? She said, my wife says, you people are idiots. She said, I see these magician friends of yours show me second deals. She said, a blind person can see they don't take the top card. She says, how is somebody going to deal a card from the center? I said, Jean, that's my wife's name, I said, I want to take you up to Pleasant Hill and see this fellow. You won't believe it. And she said, I'd like to go, because I bet he's a fake. She said, I bet I can see it every time. I said, all right, but it's a long drive, you know. I had to go from St. Joseph, which is 75 miles, and Kansas City, and then from Kansas City to Pleasant Hill. So I took my little boy, too. He was only 7 years old. So I thought, now, wait a minute, this little kid may say, my father's a magician. So I thought I better school him. I said, now, listen, Ted, his name was Edward, but I called him Ted. I said, listen, Ted, don't do any tricks for this, you know, from this man I'm going to take you. And don't say your father's a magician. Remember, don't tell him your father's a magician. But I showed him how to stack with a shuffle 4 aces, you know. Of course, you're only a little kid, 7 years old, and instead of cutting the cards, I told him to look for the big black ace. That's what I call the ace of spades. Look for the big black ace and count it 5 from the top, and then cut the cards like this, just change them over. And I taught him. It took me about half an hour to teach him this trick. And the little kid with the little hands, he managed to do it very well. So anyway, when we met this Alan Kennedy, and my wife saw him, and she agreed that I was speaking the truth, because she couldn't follow this deal. And she thought they're coming from the top, and he proved they weren't. So she believed me then. So Alan Kennedy, look, he says, you got a nice boy there. What's the boy do? Does he do anything? And I said, what do you mean? He's only a kid. I said, Ted, show him how you can stack 4 aces. So this little kid, 7 years old, he takes the ace and he runs the pack, he finds the big black ace, and he cuts it 5 from the top, and he deals the cards around, he turns over the hand, he's got 4 aces. Alan Kennedy says, boy, I want to congratulate you. You're certainly bringing that boy up right. In other words, I was teaching him when he was 7 how to cheat. But he said, you're bringing that boy up right. But it struck me. My wife got more of that was worth the trip to her, because she thought that was so amusing. Oh, and the other thing about my wife, about Mexican Joe, you know. One time, I told her about these characters. I said, Rakanakis, the Greek gambler, Mexican Joe, the gambler. And she said, oh, these characters, you make up these names. She said, well, who ever heard of Mexican Joe? She said, you've been reading some novel. You make up these names. I said, Gene, these are gamblers. They're funny characters. I don't believe you in all these stories. So one night we're walking along Broadway, and I look in the automatic lunch, and I see Mexican Joe sitting in there with a young fellow. And I said, Gene, you've got to come in here. And I took her into the automatic restaurant, and I walked up to the table, and I said, Joe, I want you to meet my wife. I said, Gene, this is Mexican Joe. He says, good evening, Mrs. Vernon. And he says, I know your husband very well. Sit down, let me buy you something to eat. My wife said, no, yeah, let me buy you something. He went over and got some jelly from my wife out of the automatic lunch, and we're sitting at the table, Mexican Joe, myself, and this friend of Mexican Joe's. So anyway, Mexican Joe's talking. Oh, my wife says, you know, I fastened cards all my life. I play cards, Mrs. Vernon. I win a lot of money playing cards. I love cards, and he's talking away. So my wife suddenly says, well, Joe, why don't you introduce me to this young man you're staying with? Oh, Mrs. Vernon, I am so sorry. You know, I'm not like a natural person. He says, when I was a boy in Mexico, I was a little boy, about 5 years old. My father says, Joe, I want you to go out and steal. He says, you go first to the bakery shop. You steal some rolls, steal some bread. Don't let the man see you steal it. He says, I go and I steal some rolls and some bread. And then come home, my father say, now you go to where they sell the cameras. You wait till nobody looking. You sneak behind, grab a camera, put it under your coat, learn to steal. Every day, he says, my father, when I'm a little boy, he teaches me, now, Joe, you're great, you're learning to steal. Now, he says, I go older and older. Then I find out you can do things with cards and steal money, and they don't arrest you. They don't put you in jail. He says, so I like to do this. I work, I practice hard. He says, I practice. Mrs. Vernon, he says, the nicer things of life. He says, I don't understand. He says, so please don't, I make mistake, I don't introduce her. But I know human being like most people, and he's talking away like this. So all of a sudden he says, Mrs. Vernon, he said, you don't understand. I walk along Broadway. Somebody says, excuse me, where's 42nd Street? He says, get away, don't bother me. He says, some fellow says, how can I get a bus? Where can I get a bus? Don't bother me. And he says, some other guy will say, listen, do you know which side of the street the Woolworth store is on? Don't bother me. But he says, some friend comes up and somebody stops me and says, Joe, I know where there's a nice card game. He says, what's that, my friend? He says, but that's the way he explained to my wife. In other words, he wanted to explain to her that nothing meant anything to him except playing cards, you know. And the way he expressed it, I mean, it's very funny. Mexican Joe.